Hi, and welcome to the Debrief, Carolina Journal's weekly recap of North Carolina politics and public policy. I'm David Larson, the opinion editor of Carolina Journal, filling in for Donna King this week, who's off with a lot of our other colleagues in Arizona at a policy conference. But we have a great show for you this week. To my right, we have Katie Zender, who's one of our reporters here at Carolina Journal. And to my left on the couches, we have Teresa Opeka, who's another of our reporters at Carolina Journal, and Mitch Kokai, Senior Policy Analyst for the John Locke Foundation. So this week, a lot going on. We want to jump right into a lot of our election coverage. Teresa Opeka, one of our reporters, has been keeping an eye on all of that. So Teresa, if you would just give us a little bit of an update.
Sure. So the North Carolina State Election Board, or Board of Elections, if you will, voted along party lines this week to allow UNC Chapel Hill students and also employees to use a mobile ID for voting this fall. Again, it was Democrats 3-2 over the two Republicans members. They argue that they met all the guidelines, all the criteria, and this is what the main thing that they have now for like their IDs, basically on their mobile phone. But there was the argument from Republican member Stacey Eggers IV. He said, that that's fine, but we did not have the statutory authority to go ahead and change this. Unlike what the state legislature did with the mobile, they're going to be approving mobile driver's licenses in 2025. He said there's a lot of concerns he had. Things could happen. They could, alter things online, stuff of that nature. But Chairman Alan Hirsch said, no, it's the way of the world right now. It's just the way things are going. And, we go to the airport, you gave your ticket on your phone. And then Mr. Eggers says, yeah, but, they're still going to ask you for your driver's license, some sort of identification to see who you are along with that ticket. And he says, Hirsch says, but yes, but you see, we're going to have those driver's licenses on your phone come next year. And then Eggers came back, well, yeah, but it was done under statutory changes. So there were some worries about that. So they said it's going to go through where the objections are there or not.
That was a lot of the complaint during last election, or
right.
During COVID, was statutorily maybe these different state boards of elections in different states didn't have the legal right to make changes, but because it's kind of an emergency situation, that happened. But it seems like maybe the same situation here, where the statute isn't clear that they can make this change, but they feel, the Board of Elections feels it's necessary, or they have is it that kind of a...
Yeah, they felt comfortable because they also asked for an expiration date on the card. Executive Director Karen Brinson-Bell said they followed all our guidelines. They have an expiration date on it, and Mr. Eggers says, well, I'm not arguing about that. It's, again, he pointed to the statutory requirements for that. So they felt confident that they met all the requirements for that.
Now, Mitch, what do you think is the impact of this new ID and just the way the ID process is going to play out in this election in general?
Probably the impact of having UNC students being able to use the mobile ID won't have a major impact one way or the other, because as with most everyone else, everyone who has one of these IDs probably also has a driver's license, which is what most people are going to use. So it probably has a negligible impact. Maybe there are a few people who didn't have another form of valid ID who will only use this online ID. But a couple of things that are of note to me. One is this debate at the Board of Elections seemed to be about not whether this was a good idea, a bad idea, whether it would be an ID that would meet other criteria, but whether the law, which the State Board of Elections has to follow, would permit something that's not an actual physical card or document. And that seemed to be what separated the Democrats on the board from the Republicans. The other thing that we ought to point out is this whole thing could end up being moot, because we're still waiting for a federal judge to decide whether voter ID is going to be allowed for the November election. We know that Judge Loretta Biggs had a trial back in May. It lasted for a couple of weeks. She has already signaled in the past that she's not a fan of voter ID, and so she could strike down the voter ID law at any time. Now, Republican legislators have asked her that if she does, that she stay that ruling while they appeal, because they think they're going to win, and they think the Fourth Circuit, or if not the Fourth Circuit, the Supreme Court will say your voter ID is fine. But We don't know whether Biggs will stay her ruling, and we also don't know when that ruling is going to come down. So it's entirely possible that all this debate about voter ID could be moot if a federal judge strikes it down and there's no successful appeal before November 5th.
Seems like the voter ID situation has always been just hanging in flux. There's always a lawsuit that just might come down right before the elections. But so Teresa, what else have you been looking at in terms of the campaigns? I'm sure there've been people stopping in and.
Yeah, so the election board had one more order of business. They voted unanimously, begrudgingly, to allow all Justice for All party to be on the ballot, and that's Cornel West's party, because they were ordered by a court to be on the ballot. You know, member Siobhan Millen said our hand was forced in this, so that's why they voted in favor of it. So that also was a detail that came up this week. And we're talking about allowing different parties on the ballot. We have RFK in his the We the People, and that was just settled. But yeah, there's all this news coming out tomorrow. He's going to make an announcement, and everybody's suspecting that he's going to be dropping out of the race and endorsing Donald Trump, and that Donald Trump is going to be maybe possibly offering him a cabinet position. And I think you were pointing out to me off camera before that, you know, if they got some of the votes that RFK, if Trump got some of the votes, that could actually have a meaningful impact.
Absolutely, yeah. Looks like in a lot of the swing states, he had been up close to double digits. Mm-hmm. It's come down quite a bit to maybe 3, 4, 5% in a lot of these swing states. But if he gets most of that, let's say 4% in a state, that actually could have a huge impact on these really tight states.
Right.
So was it Nicole Shanahan, who's RFK Jr.'s vice president, running mate? She was on Fox News earlier saying that the situation is they're going to team up with the Trump administration. Yep. So that's pretty big news.
Yeah.
And I thought it was interesting that a big part of her rationale there is that Clear Choice PAC and some Democrat operations had been trying so hard to keep them off the ballot that they just don't feel like they're going to be able to fully run the campaign they wanted to. Yeah. So some of that, those efforts that the Democratic Party thought that were going to help them, it might end up kind of blowing back on them a bit if that RFK vote goes that way. But yeah, so very interesting. Anything else going on on the visits or?
Yeah, of course we had Trump Vance yesterday in Asheboro. They gave a great, Vance spoke ahead of Trump, and then Trump came on a little after 2 o'clock, and then actually an interesting, Trump invited all sheriffs across the state and some other police officers, if you will, police personnel to come up on the stage, and had a little bit of a jibe to Mark Robinson. Yeah. Well, no, I won't go into that. But it was interesting. There was a woman who almost fainted there. So as you saw, there was bulletproof glass now, since this is the first outdoor rally that he's done since his assassination attempt in Pennsylvania last month. But he got down to check on this lady, gave her a hug, said, "You okay? Drink a lot of water." And she says, I'm glad to meet you. She was okay. They're calling for a medic. So that was an interesting highlight. But he touted all his past accomplishments, how he was safer under, how the country was safer under him versus what Kamala Harris could, possibly do to this country, that we're on the brink of a third world war. So it was very interesting, and he kept his energy up. A lot of people said he's been faltering lately, but for talking for over an hour, he did very well yesterday.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And Katie, you were keeping track on the other side of the aisle. We have a lot of campaign stops from, I guess being part of a swing state, being in a swing state, that's part of the deal. But you also saw Kamala Harris had dropped by and gave a speech as well.
Right. So Kamala Harris was in Raleigh last Friday. She spoke about price gouging. She promises to work on a federal ban to ban price gouging if she is elected. And then Trump was in Asheville again last week. And yeah, so just kind of like comparing these two speeches. I didn't watch the Trump speech, but I did speak with RNC Chairman Michael Whatley. And so, yeah, so if Kamala is elected, she promises to let the tax cuts expire, the Trump tax cuts expire. This would be the largest tax increase in our nation's history, according to RNC Chairman Michael Whatley. Yet Kamala criticizes Trump's universal tariffs and says that he has no serious plan to reduce costs. while avoiding revealing what her alleged plan is. She says that she has a plan, but she really doesn't go into a lot of detail on what that plan is. She does promise to increase competition in the food market. You know, groceries are up, rent is up, gas is up. Groceries and rent are up by 20%, gas is up by 50% from last year, yet wages are down 3 to 4%. So American families are really feeling the squeeze on their budgets. Groceries are going up actually because of the cost to grow them and because of the cost of packaging and transportation, not because grocery stores are jacking up the price and the price margin of their products.
Yeah, I saw a stat on that, I think, on that the actual profit margin of these grocery stores has slightly gone down. So
Yes.
it's interesting that some politicians are calling, like Kamala was saying, that it would be good to have some kind of price controls. There's been price gouging, and so pretty interesting to look at the economics of that. But you know, maybe shifting away from that in the context of the presidential campaign. But John Locke Foundation has been working on Sowing Resilience, an agriculture documentary based, you know, looking at North Carolina agriculture, and you've been hard at work on
Yes.
that, and we're just this week released the second episode of that.
Yes.
I don't know if you could say a little bit about kind of what that second episode looked like.
Yeah, absolutely. So the second episode is called Instability, where we're really focusing on food insecurity, what it is it a real thing, what are food deserts? So we look at food insecurity, and we talk to people, you know, all across North Carolina. What is food insecurity? Do you think that's a real thing? There are people that don't believe that food insecurity is a real thing. And so in the documentary, really the way that we define food insecurity is the lack of consistent access to enough food for an active and healthy lifestyle. I believe the USDA has a slightly different definition for food insecurity, but you know, there's all these different definitions floating around, but they basically all mean essentially the same thing. And then we're looking at access to food. So a lot of people that don't believe in food insecurity, it's not because there's no food, it's that there's a hard time for like getting the food to these people, whether that be pricing, transportation, production supply chain interruptions, whatever that be, we can't get the food to these people. So it's not necessarily that there's a lack of food, it's getting the food to the people, whether that be, you know, making food more affordable, looking at supply chain issues, whatever that might be. And then there's a couple of factors that we look at in the documentary, but stability. So it's maybe you're not food insecure now, but if you have, you know, consistent periods of food insecurity over time, you're still considered to be food insecure. And then we look at food deserts. So in urban areas, if you're more than 1 mile away from a major grocery store or supermarket, you're considered to be in a food desert. In rural areas, that's going to be a 10-mile radius. And then we looked at a few poll results. Back in May, the John Locke Foundation polled 800 North Carolinians. 96% noticed an increase in prices. 82% found it more difficult to afford the same amount of food as the same time last year. However, 90% did say that they have reliable access or reliable transportation to finding food, whether that be a grocery store, a farmer's market, whatever it might be. And then we talked to farmers and looked at what farmers are saying in terms of, you know, what can we do to address food insecurity? A lot of them talked about increasing awareness around food insecurity. And then at the legislative level, you know, getting lawmakers to provide education and awareness surrounding food insecurity. And then one of the farmers actually had the idea of building committees to go out into these food deserts and, you know, talk to people, do research, look at solutions to how we can actually address these issues. And then another farmer that we talked to talked about storage and distribution. You know, these are not glamorous aspects of agriculture, so people don't like to look at these, but these are some of the key, you know, key components of food instability and food insecurity: refrigeration, trucking, storage facilities. If there's a delay in, you know, getting a truck to where it's going and that truck isn't refrigerated, that's, you know, maybe 150 meals that have to be thrown away because they couldn't get it to the people and it wasn't in the proper storage facilities. And so this looks at eliminating bureaucracy and streamlining was another suggestion from farmers. And then grassroots programming, connecting farmers to local feeding programs. And then, again, this is an opportunity to introduce the regulatory sandbox to agriculture in North Carolina.
What is a regulatory sandbox?
Right, so a regulatory sandbox is an area for innovation and experimentation within a certain sphere. And so we're looking at, you know, North Carolina has this regulatory sandbox. We're looking at applying that to agriculture so that farmers can innovate and work with technology and find ways for experimentation without the burden of regulations in a safe atmosphere, and discover new solutions to these issues that we're looking at.
Interesting. Yeah, I thought it was a great documentary. I watched the second episode, and for me it was interesting to see how much of the costs, like we were saying earlier, the grocery stores aren't randomly getting a bigger price margin. They're getting more expensive food, and so they're kind of needing to raise their prices to keep the same margin. And the farmers are just experiencing a lot of extra costs. And it was interesting to me how much of those costs were around energy, where, to get the diesel they need to operate the farm equipment, and then the packaging is made out of, oil, and then to transport it, just so much of it comes down to really high energy costs that are forcing them to increase that. And also labor, it's difficult to get labor, you have to pay more now to get people to work on a farm. So a lot of very interesting issues there. I guess maybe another thing I thought was just maybe not getting food in general, but getting healthy food was a big part of it, because yes, maybe in this rural area there is a Dollar General 15 miles away or something, and you can go there, but they have mostly prepackaged foods. Might be affordable per calorie, but the quality of food per calorie they're getting might not be a lot. So there's some topics there that were interesting to see as well.
Exactly.
I'll tell you something funny. I was on vacation in Pennsylvania last week and actually stopped in a Dollar General, and I was surprised to see fresh fruits and vegetables in the front of the store.
So
Again, it was they're working on it. They had tomatoes, they had a bunch of stuff, and I'm like, it's very interesting. I think it's in an area, obviously, too, there's not a grocery store around. So maybe they are trying to incorporate that. But I found that very interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One thing I find interesting about this debate is we talk about the issues of food insecurity and food deserts, and my guess is that some of the people who are saying they don't believe in these things just don't like the slogans. Like if you said, all right, do you think it's probably harder for some people to get access to food now than it was last year or 5 years ago? They might say, yeah, but they didn't think of that as food insecurity. Or, hey, are there some spots where it's hard to find a easily accessible grocery store? Yes, sure, but they didn't think of it as a food desert. So some of it's just the language that's used. But my guess is most people have seen, because of inflation, because of all the factors that you've been talking about, that it is harder to feed themselves and their families today than it was 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Some of that is just terminology that makes people, because I think there was a time when the term food desert was sort of something that free marketeers would scoff at, maybe because it was being used by people who wanted the government to kind of micromanage food and would do it in ways that make it less efficient. But we can kind of maybe see the same problem but have different solutions to it. But I wanted to turn back to you, Mitch, and just discuss, I know you keep a close eye on the courts for us here, and there's one case you've been keeping an eye on for quite a while, and you might miss it soon. You might.
Yeah, I won't miss it if it goes away, but we're talking about the Leandro case. Tomorrow is the next opinion release date for the state Supreme Court. We don't know what cases are going to come out, but one that could come out is the latest ruling in the long-running Leandro school funding case, named so because the original plaintiff, who's now a lawyer in his 40s, but back then was a student in Hope County schools 30 years ago when this case started. This case has been dealing with education funding issues and the need to deal with North Carolina constitutional requirement that kids have access for the opportunity for sound basic education. So basically, over the past couple of decades plus, there's been a whole debate about how to deal with that. And the most recent major ruling in Leandro that came out in November of 2022, back when our state Supreme Court still had a 4-3 Democratic majority, was that it was okay for a trial judge to order more than $1 billion in new education spending without any input from the General Assembly. And it was okay for that judge to order executive branch officials to move the money without the General Assembly having any say-so. Well, after that ruling came out and the case went back to a trial judge, voters flipped the script of the state Supreme Court and changed the majority to 5-2 Republican. Republican legislative leaders went back to the Supreme Court and said, hey, take another look at this. We don't think that the judge in this case should have been able to issue a ruling that has a statewide impact when the only trial that's ever taken place in this case years ago dealt with the students in one county? How can you get to a statewide solution for this case that's only ever had a trial in one county? The state Supreme Court was willing to take up the issue again. They held oral arguments in February. It's now been long enough that if you wanted to write even 50 or 60 or 100 pages on this, you'd have time to do it. So it's possible that we will get a ruling tomorrow in the Leandro case. And if we do, there's a potential that Leandro ruling could kind of cripple the case. If the justices on the Supreme Court, it would probably be a 5-2 ruling with the 5 Republicans on one side, the 2 Democrats on the other. If the Republicans say, no, this judge didn't have any right to do that, we kind of have to go back to the drawing board in terms of getting a solution to this case. That could end up crippling the case. I wrote a column earlier this week on Carolina Journal that suggested that could be good news in terms of actually getting to a solution for the problem that we have with education finances in North Carolina, because all of the people who've been saying fully fund Leandro might have to come up with a new slogan, and their new slogan might be, well, let's actually do something about the actual problem with education finances. And we know our friends at the John Locke Foundation at the Center for Effective Education are working on a report on this exact topic of how you fix finances in the schools. So we could see very interesting results. There are also some other cases hanging out there at the Supreme Court that could deal with that ACE Speedway shutdown. Probably not tomorrow because they've asked for more information. But the COVID case, they've got probably not tomorrow, but they soon will be ruling on the certificate of need dispute about the eye surgeon in New Bern who wants to be able to do surgeries in his vision center, but because of state rules, he has to go to a hospital a couple miles away and charge several $1,000s more for the same procedure. So lots of stuff cooking at the state Supreme Court. Leandro is probably the biggest one out there.
Yeah, it's an exciting time. I think if there's been precedent that's sort of built up over a long period of time, and then now all of a sudden we have more originalist justices that are all of these precedents have sort of built up over time, and then they kind of look at the very basic, like, should all of this even be discussed at all? Should a justice, or should the courts be able to just order the General Assembly to spend this precise number of dollars because something in the Constitution, guarantees a right to a sound basic education, so guarantees, so I think that'll be an interesting thing in a lot of areas, just to see how the originalist justices that are now have a 5-2 majority will approach a lot of these things that had been just assumed this is the precedent, this is how it is, but maybe at their root level didn't have a lot of grounding in the Constitution and will just be kind of tossed aside. Maybe Leandro soon will hear that's what will happen there.
Yeah, and I don't think that they're going to go back and say the original 1997 Supreme Court ruling in Leandro was wrong. I mean, I don't think that they're challenging anything that's, in terms of the justices on the court who make up the majority now, challenging anything that's come out of Leandro in its early stages. But they really do have a question about the ruling that came out in November of 2022, which had basically the 2 pieces. One was the judge saying, you got to follow this plan that this consultant in San Francisco came up with and spend this money on it. There's that. And then the piece that has an even larger separation of powers concern, and that is, we're going to say, General Assembly, doesn't matter what you do, the state Office of Budget Management Director, State Treasurer, and State Controller, you're going to move this money without the General Assembly having any say-so. We know that one reason that hasn't happened is that the controller, it was actually the old controller, but the new controller, who was appointed by Cooper, is following the same legal strategy, and that was, I can't move that money. I would be violating my oath of office. I could be impeached and go to jail. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens with that.
Absolutely. Well, there's a lot to keep an eye on here. We'll have more political updates, I'm sure, more episodes of Sowing Resilience and more court cases. But until next week, I think that's all for us. And please tune back in then. Thanks a lot.